The room is perfect. The wallpaper is a deep, saturated emerald green, the color every London socialite has been requesting since the pattern appeared in the shop windows of Regent Street. The curtains are heavy burgundy velvet, trimmed with a fringe that cost more per yard than a factory worker earns in a week. The woodwork is painted in a glossy, creamy white, so dense and opaque it seems almost luminous in the gaslight. Your housekeeper aired the room this morning. Your children played here this afternoon. Your youngest fell asleep on the rug at 4:30, and you carried her upstairs yourself, past the hallway with the new paper, the one in the fashionable willow pattern, and into the nursery, where the walls are painted that same clean, bright white. It is 1888. Your home is one of the most beautiful in the street, and it is slowly poisoning everyone inside it. Now, look at the same room again. The emerald wallpaper contains copper arsenite, a compound manufactured since 1814 and used in virtually every green pigment sold in Britain, Germany, and the United States throughout the Victorian era. It is named after Carl Wilhelm Scheele, the Swedish chemist who synthesized it in 1775. It became known as Scheele's green, and for most of the 19th century, it was the most popular color in domestic decoration. The creamy white woodwork contains white lead carbonate mixed with linseed oil, the standard base for virtually all interior paint in the Victorian period. It is dense. It is opaque. It dries to a surface so hard and smooth that no competing product could match it until well into the 20th century. And the children who live in this house, who touch the skirting boards, who press their faces against the cool painted walls in summer, who put their fingers in their mouths the way children always do, are ingesting both. To understand how this happened, how an entire society decorated its homes with substances that were actively harmful, you need to understand what the word poison meant to a Victorian household. It meant something you swallowed deliberately. It meant arsenic in the wine, or strychnine in the food, or a deliberate act with a clear and immediate result. The idea that a substance could harm you slowly, across months or years, through air and dust and the unconscious contact of daily life, was not part of the dominant medical understanding of the 1880s. Toxicology as a science existed, but the science of chronic, low-dose exposure, the kind that does not kill you dramatically but quietly degrades your nervous system, your cognition, your organs, over the course of years, was still forming. Which is why when children in fashionable London households became inexplicably listless, lost their appetite, developed persistent headaches and nausea, the diagnosis was almost never the wallpaper. If this kind of investigation is what you come here for, the version of history that strips away the surface and examines what was actually happening underneath, subscribe to The Past Restored. We publish regularly, and the next episode goes somewhere you probably haven't considered. The cholera outbreak that accidentally gave us modern urban planning. Now back to the walls. Scheele's green was not the only arsenic-based pigment in the Victorian color palette. Emerald green, also called Paris green or Schweinfurt green, was a more vivid, more expensive variant, copper acetoarsenite. It appeared in wallpapers, dress fabrics, artificial flowers worn in the hair, children's toy soldiers, and the green paper used to wrap sweets. The demand for these colors was enormous. In Britain alone, estimates suggest that by the 1850s, more than 100 million square meters of arsenic-dyed paper were being produced annually. 100 million square meters. Enough to cover a significant portion of the country's interior walls. The mechanism of harm was twofold. The first was dust. As wallpaper aged, as it dried, cracked, was brushed against by coats and sleeves, was disturbed by the opening and closing of windows, it shed fine particles. Those particles carried the arsenic compound with them into the air of the room, onto the surfaces of furniture, onto the hands and faces of the people inside. The second mechanism was invisible, and it was not identified until 1892, 4 years after the year we are in. The Italian chemist Bartolomeo Gosio discovered that certain common household molds, the kind that grow on damp wallpaper paste in London's perpetually humid rooms, metabolize the arsenic compounds in the paper and release them as a gas. Trimethylarsine. Colorless, odorless at low concentrations, though some contemporary accounts describe a faint, sweetish smell, like garlic left too long in a warm room. The gas was heavier than air. It settled. In the Victorian bedroom, where a person lay still for 8 hours with windows closed against the cold, the concentration at mattress height was highest. This is why so many of the documented cases involved patients who appeared to recover when they left their homes for extended periods, a seaside holiday, a stay with relatives, and relapsed when they returned. The doctors called it a mystery of constitution. The wallpaper was never considered. There is a theory, contested but documented, that Napoleon Bonaparte died on the island of St. Helena in 1821, partly as a consequence of the arsenic green wallpaper in the rooms where he spent his final years. A lock of his hair, preserved and tested in the 20th century, contained arsenic at levels significantly above what would be expected in a person with no industrial exposure. The wallpaper in the Longwood House rooms has been confirmed to have contained Sheila's green. Whether this contributed to his death or was coincidental, historians and toxicologists still disagree. But it is a useful illustration of the scale of the problem. If the most famous exile in the world was sleeping under arsenic-laced walls, the families in the terrace houses of Manchester and Birmingham had no particular reason to think they were any different. Now, the white walls. Lead paint had been in use for centuries before the Victorian period. The Romans used it. The Dutch painters of the 17th century, Vermeer, Rembrandt, De Hoek, used lead white as their primary ground and mixed it into virtually every color on their palettes. The entire tradition of European oil painting was built, in part, on a neurotoxin. In the Victorian home, lead paint served a different purpose. It covered. It sealed. It produced the high-gloss, almost reflective surfaces that Victorian interior design prized, the kind of finish that showed off gaslight to maximum effect and could be wiped clean with a damp cloth. And it had one additional property that made it particularly dangerous in domestic spaces. Lead carbonate, white lead, is slightly sweet. Not intensely, not in a way that an adult would register as flavor, but to a child who runs their hand along a painted skirting board and then puts their fingers in their mouth, it does not taste like a warning. The neurological effects of lead poisoning in children were documented in medical literature as far back as 1840. The symptoms were recognizable in retrospect: irritability, loss of appetite, developmental regression, convulsions in severe cases. What the medical community of the 1880s had not yet established, what it would take until well into the 20th century to prove in terms the legal system would accept, was that low-level, chronic exposure in children who showed no dramatic symptoms was nonetheless causing permanent cognitive damage. Lower IQ, reduced attention span, increased impulsivity, changes to the developing brain that would never be reversed, and that no one in the household had any reason to connect to the color of the woodwork. Here is the element of this story that I keep returning to when I research this period. The people who were harmed were not ignorant. The parents who decorated the nurseries with bright white paint and fashionable green paper were, many of them, educated and attentive. They read the newspapers. They consulted doctors. They worried, as parents always worry, about the health of their children. But the information that would have connected the wallpaper to the illness, the chemistry, the toxicology, the biology of chronic exposure, was not available to them. Not because it was suppressed, because it had not yet been discovered. The arsenic gas mechanism, 1892. The formal link between lead paint and childhood neurological damage, 1943. Lead paint banned in residential use in the United States, 1978. In the United Kingdom, 1992. More than a century between the widespread introduction of the problem and the legislative response to it. There were warnings. William Morris, the designer whose wallpaper patterns defined the aesthetic movement and whose work is still reproduced today, used Shayla's green in a significant portion of his early designs. He was aware of the concerns. He disputed them publicly, calling the fears exaggerated and the anti-arsenic campaign the work of people who did not understand chemistry. His business partner, Thomas Wardle, was more cautious. By the 1880s, Morris and Company had begun producing arsenic-free alternatives for clients who specifically requested them. The alternatives cost more. The demand for the originals continued. In Germany, a coalition of physicians began campaigning against arsenic wallpaper as early as 1870. Bavaria introduced a ban in 1879. Britain did not follow. The wallpaper trade argued that the evidence was inconclusive. The chemical manufacturers argued that the quantities involved were negligible. The interior design press continued to print color supplements featuring emerald greens and willow patterns as the height of domestic taste. By the final decade of the 19th century, public opinion was beginning to shift, partly because of the accumulated weight of medical reports, partly because of the publications of reformers like the Ladies' Sanitary Association, which had been pressing for domestic safety standards since the 1850s, and which was, by the 1880s, starting to achieve a readership large enough to influence purchasing decisions, and partly because of what happened when renovators began stripping the old papers. The dry scraping of Victorian wallpaper, releasing decades of accumulated dust in enclosed rooms, caused acute symptoms that even the most skeptical observers could not easily dismiss. The industry did not wait for legislation. By the late 1890s, several of the major British manufacturers had voluntarily reformulated their green pigments. Not because the law required it, because the market had decided that a wallpaper associated with illness was harder to sell. The house in 1888 still stands in most Victorian cities. Not the same house, obviously, but the same terrace, the same street, the same construction, brick, lath, plaster, timber, and in many cases, the same layers of paint underneath every renovation since. In Britain, it is estimated that more than 500,000 homes built before 1945 still contain lead paint beneath their current surface decoration. In the United States, the figure runs into the millions. The paint is stable when intact. It becomes dangerous when it deteriorates, when it chips, when it is sanded, when a renovation project opens a wall and releases decades of leaded dust into a room where children are playing. The Victorian problem did not end in the Victorian period. It went under the surface. It is still there. The sources for this episode include the research of James C. Wharton, whose book, The Arsenic Century, remains the standard academic account of arsenic's role in Victorian life and death. The Gosio gas discovery of 1892 is documented in contemporary Italian chemical literature and in later analyses by Frederick Challenger, who confirmed the mechanism in 1945. The Napoleon arsenic theory was most extensively examined by David Jones and Kenneth Ledingham in a paper published in Nature in 1980. The lead paint exposure data for existing housing stock comes from surveys conducted by Public Health England and the United States Environmental Protection Agency. A note on the William Morris controversy. The historical record is genuinely mixed. Morris dismissed the arsenic concerns in letters that have been published and are widely cited. His later pivot toward arsenic-free products is documented in the Morris and Company business records. Whether his earlier dismissal reflected genuine skepticism or commercial calculation, the archive does not settle the question. Here is where I want to leave you. In 1888, the most dangerous things in a Victorian home were its most beautiful elements, chosen deliberately, maintained carefully, admired by visitors, and completely invisible as a threat. The people who lived under those walls did not think of themselves as taking risks. They thought of themselves as doing the best they could, furnishing a home, raising children, participating in the material culture of their time. In 2026, we are exposed to per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS, in non-stick cookware, food packaging, waterproof clothing, and the fire-suppressing foam used at airports and military bases. They are in groundwater across 6 continents. They are in human blood. They are called forever chemicals because they do not break down. The regulatory science on PFAS is still forming. The debates about acceptable exposure levels are ongoing. Several of the compounds have been linked to cancer, hormonal disruption, and developmental effects in children. Several of the manufacturers have known about these links for decades. I am not making a prediction. I am noting that the Victorian family in their emerald green parlor was also not making a choice they understood to be dangerous. The question worth carrying is not what they did wrong. It is what we are doing right now that we have not yet learned to see. What do you think the future will hold us accountable for? The comments on this channel are worth reading. The conversations there go places I don't always anticipate. If you're not subscribed yet, this is the kind of episode that runs regularly here. And if you want to follow the science of urban contamination from the Victorian age forward, the next episode takes you to London in 1854, where a single water pump changed how we understand disease forever. Click the video on your screen. This was the past restored. See you in the next archive.